All right, today we are going to talk about the structure of the federal court. So we'll spend a little more time talking about those lower levels of court and what they do, what the differences are between these lower forms of court and the Supreme Court. We'll go through all these different levels of court and eventually wind up right back here at what you see, the Supreme Court of the United States. So our objective today, we want to make sure that we are able to describe the structure of the federal court system. So we'll get into the main things of what the lower levels of courts do. We'll talk a little bit about the Supreme Court here, but we need to be able to explain how the court system operates. So if we're able to describe the different roles of the different levels of courts, hopefully we'll better be able to explain how the courts operate in the United States. So the main question we're answering today is, how are the courts in the United States designed? So the first thing we're going to talk about today is jurisdiction. So we're going to be talking about different levels of court, different ways that different courts hear about different cases. So hopefully you may or may not recognize this building, the inside of this building in the background here. This is the basement of 201 Poplar. So this is our local courts. So this is where you may have to go to court if you've got like a traffic issue or like a minor crime or something like that. So we'll be talking about state courts, federal courts, different levels, and all of that. All right, first up, I'm going to be throwing around the word jurisdiction today. When you hear the word jurisdiction, we mostly are just saying which court has the ability to hear that case. So depending on the type of situation or depending on like where this thing happened, different courts will have the power to decide the issue in that case. And so that's what we mean when we're talking about jurisdiction. Also here you see a familiar old diagram that we used when we were talking about federalism. The first thing we're going to do today is talk about the differences between state courts and federal courts. So in this case, over on the left, my blue side is going to represent state courts, which, that's state jurisdiction. So that means the issue is something that would be decided by the state courts. And over on the right side, in the red, we'll have the federal courts. The federal courts, just like in federalism, we call this exclusive jurisdiction. That means that this is something that can only be decided by a federal court. There's going to be a little bit of stuff that overlaps right there in the middle, our kind of purple overlapping circle. That's where we're going to have concurrent jurisdiction. So there'll be some issues that could be a state issue and could also be a federal issue, like some kind of like a crime that involved a violation of civil rights is like a crime on a state level, but also has implications because of the 14th Amendment. The federal government can oversee that. So we'll talk a little bit about that, but mostly we're focusing on what's state jurisdiction versus what is federal jurisdiction, exclusive jurisdiction. First up, we'll talk about state jurisdiction. So here we see, this might be maybe the most famous judge we have in the United States. This is Judge Judy. Judge Judy, actually a real judge in the state of New York. And so she would, a long time ago, have actually been a judge in real cases before she moved on to TV judge. But state jurisdiction is going to cover things that are state laws. So that's going to be a lot of the court, like the vast majority of all court cases just end up in state courts. So that's going to be most criminal cases, like almost all criminal cases end up in state jurisdiction. If it's going to be national government courts, if it's going to be federal courts and exclusive jurisdiction, it's got to be a violation of federal laws. And we know the Constitution very well. There's not a whole lot in there. So everything that gets left up to the states is covered by state courts. So think back to when we were dividing the powers under federalism. Things that would be left up to state courts, most crime, because health and safety stuff was that way. Alcohol laws, so like a violation of some type of alcohol purchasing or something like that, you end up in state court. Traffic violations, marriages don't go to court, but divorces do, so divorces are in state courts. And if you end up suing somebody, if there's a civil case and both of you are from the same state, that ends up in state court. So states can decide issues between citizens in their own states. So all this stuff is left up to state courts. So it wouldn't go beyond the state court system. and the national government's not even involved here. So this is really the vast majority of all things that end up in court. The national government's courts, that's federal jurisdiction. So we're talking about the national government's court system. So the things that fall under federal jurisdiction or exclusive jurisdiction, these are violations of national law. So we're going to look first at what's in the Constitution and then other things that have been, passed by Congress. So things that show up in the Constitution would be like interstate commerce. So if you've committed a crime that involves interstate commerce, that might be something like credit card fraud or crime over the internet, things like that. That's interstate commerce, so the federal government's involved. The Constitution said only Congress can coin money. So if you are counterfeiting money, that ends up in federal court. If you commit a crime with the post office, that's in the Constitution, so it ends up in federal court. Then things that are a little too complicated for a state to handle. So if a crime involved more than one state, that becomes a federal issue. Like if you were to kidnap a person and take them across state lines, now you've committed a crime in 2 different states. So the national government will decide that issue. And we've talked about if there are lawsuits, civil suits between people from different states. If you are a person in Tennessee and you sue a person in Mississippi, we want to make sure that both people get a fair trial. And so it would be unfair to put that trial in Tennessee, unfair to put that in Mississippi. We want to make sure there's no bias. So that ends up in the United States of America court. All right, there's just a little bit that we're going to worry about with concurrent jurisdiction, but it just means that the issue may fall under either the state courts or the national courts. So it kind of depends on the situation, but stuff like taxes. Taxes was a concurrent power, so depending on how you may have committed a crime on your taxes or what the tax issue might be, that would decide what court you get to. Same would be true with something like illegal drugs, like they're illegal by the state and they're illegal nationally. So depending on, the issue, like how you were arrested, things like that, would determine which court you end up going to. All right, so the other issue, we did federal versus state jurisdiction. The other thing we want to look at is original jurisdiction versus appellate jurisdiction. Now this happens in the state and national governments, but since this is U.S. government, we're really only going to focus on federal courts here. So original jurisdiction basically means that this is the first court to hear a case. So that's not the only thing we need to know about it here, but this is the first court that's going to hear the case. And what the first court does is they deal with the facts of the issue. So in a criminal case, pretty simple here, we're trying to find out, is this person guilty of a crime? So I'm going to use the example of a court case you may, I think, have heard of from U.S. history classes called Miranda versus Arizona. It's the reason we have Miranda rights. So Miranda kidnapped a lady and murdered a lady, and he was caught by police and was questioned for a long time. He didn't really understand what was going on, and he confessed to the crime. So here at original jurisdiction, we just want to know, is Miranda guilty of the crime? And so absolutely, Miranda confessed to the crime. That's the main fact that we need. So Miranda's guilty and we can move on. So at the original jurisdiction level, we're trying to determine the facts of the case. Next up is appellate jurisdiction. Appellate jurisdiction means that this is the second or possibly third court to hear the case. This is a court that is reviewing the decisions that the court of original jurisdiction made. So they're just looking at the way the case was decided and trying to see if the court did the right thing. So where the earlier court dealt with the facts of the case, here in appellate jurisdiction, we're going to deal with the treatment of the case. We're going to be focusing on whether or not the people were treated fairly, like were there problems with trial, were there mistakes made, was the jury fair, things like that. So this is going to focus not on the facts of the case, but on the constitutional issues. Was this person treated fairly? So I'll go back to our example of Miranda versus Arizona. Now, we know the facts of the case are that he committed the crime, so he's guilty of the crime. But was he treated fairly? and he was questioned by police for a long time. He was not a constitutional expert himself, so he did not know that he did not have to speak to police. He did not know that he could get a lawyer and things like that. So the court ruled that his rights were violated, that he was not treated fairly. And of course, the result of the case is that now all police inform you of your rights upon arrest or questioning or whatever. So appellate jurisdiction means they're going to review the issues that may have occurred in the court of original jurisdiction. All right, so that's jurisdiction. That's the first thing we've got to understand. We want to understand the differences between state and federal jurisdiction, and we want to understand especially the differences between original and appellate jurisdiction.